Sue explained it a little bit last night why we're grateful for Thee to be here with us this week. I wanted to put my own little bit personal spin on it. Thee and I first met, I think it would have been 1995 at the Cover Conference. Sue mentioned last night that Thee is one of the founding members of Cover, the Colloquium on Violence and Religion. That was formed around 91, 92, somewhere in there, to do work around the theory, mimetic theory. It's a broader base group of folks from all over the world, really. But Thee actually hosted the conference in Atlanta for us in 1999, was it? Okay. And that might have been the last time I've seen you in person. So part of it was just being able to see you again. And we've communicated a bit over the years, mostly over the lectionary and preaching. And Thee is a person who does wear many, many hats. He is a longtime teacher at Emory, professor. He's a priest at St. Philip Episcopal Church in Atlanta. He is also a registered mediator in the state of Georgia, a certified teacher of reevaluation counseling. He's an author. Curing Violence, 1995, I think, around there, somewhere in that. Thee is one of the editors. It's a collection of essays on the mimetic theory. And then Thee's own book by himself, Conjuring Culture, Biblical Foundations of Black America. You know, reading a little bit of mimetic theory in with doing some analysis of African American culture and African culture. But I think that what Thee has done since we last saw in 1995, and is co-founding Southern Truth and Reconciliation, he had a chance to meet and work with Desmond Tutu a number of years ago, and talking about the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa, and working with the idea that we could use a bit of that here in America. More than a little bit. In fact, we've talked a little bit already about the fact that in creating beloved community, to be able to accept invitations to one another, we might have a little truth-telling to do first in working through in reconciliation. So Thee, we're excited that he's a worker of mimetic theory from way back, and can bring that in some creative and unique ways to our theme of beloved community. And just the overall theme for me, subtitle, A Theory Practice Presentation. Mimetic theory is in some ways a theory in search of a practice. In fact, I think Rene would say himself that his theory is more heavily weighted on the side of diagnosis, and not as much on what do we do about it. How do we put these insights into practice for healing and reconciliation in community. And perhaps we're all getting the sense together today and this week that Theology and Peace is still a group of folks, theory in search of a practice. We're a diaspora, the Theology and Peace members. We go back to our places and try to put theory into practice in various ways. But collectively, as we come each year, can we have collaborations and partnerships and be in community with folks who can guide us into a substantial practice? So we're very excited to welcome Thee here this week to give us some guidance and insight into that. So, excuse me, please, I've been talking a lot today, so I'm having trouble with it at this point. Please help me in welcoming Thee.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thank you all for the welcome. I've had a kind of ecstatic experience of reviewing this material to fit your theme on the one hand, but also to kind of showcase the work I've been doing on it for feels like 20 years. So your reception, your attention is like key to my having the joy. Otherwise I have many joyless experiences, working with this material. So getting the coherence of it and trying to have some beauty and accessibility to it has been a real exhilaration. So thank you for being the occasion for that, and Paul for remembering our connection. I'm grateful. I want to say something about my name because it's helpful, especially like with my students. So I teach college at Emory University, so I like to play a little word game with them around this name, and why not treat you to it as well, especially since I just taught my last semester. I'm retiring from Emory University after 31 years, yeah. So I'm eager to do all kinds of rites of passage and transition. Could you pull this open for me? I just can't get it off there. I know there's another one here somewhere. Yeah, that's got industrial strength. Okay. All right, thank you, thanks. So this is, St. Luke writes his gospel to, and also the book of Acts, to dear Theophilus. And then my father, who, by the way, his death anniversary was just this last Sunday, 2015, at the age of 92, shortened it to Theophus. And then my third grade fellow students shortened it to Thee. And how's your Greek, anyone? So, say again?
Lover of God.
Lover of God. So philos is in philanthropy or philosophy, love of wisdom. Or, and the Greek form can go either way. You can also have Philotheus as another version of it. And Philotheus can also work. How is anyone on the Latin form of this name? How's your Latin? What would the Latin be? Love in Latin is what? Amor. And God in Latin is? And so the popular form of this name is what? Amadeus. Right. Yes. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So lots of lovers of God, and I'm happy to be numbered among them with you, shortened to Thee. So I've been working a lot to figure out how to get this mimetic theory into practice, as Paul says, and that's really kind of been my burden in the cover, my kind of Girardian burden, and I think I figured out a thing or two about it. So here are the parts of it for your target practice, a mimetic theory. Used to be a red light on this. Let's see if I can get it to light up.
It's down below. Point down a little bit.
Oh yeah, you're right. I have
Might
to.
not show on that screen.
Oh, the screen scatters the light. Gotcha. So, target practice would be my version of a mimetic theory. I actually have some cartoons, some Girardian cartoons called Mimetic Theory for Laughs. I really worked hard on that part. And then Paul mentioned that I organized Cover Conference in 1999 in Atlanta. I have a little flyer about that. It's entertaining. And then I want to talk about the problem based on a specific use of the word problem in the literature. And then rehearsing, I call it the problem. I have an atonement theory about the problem, and then I want to rehearse an atonement practice with you. And so I'd like to model this practice before dinner, and then after dinner have you come back and practice it with me. So, and then I've got various appendices. So I don't know if you've ever seen an 80-something page PowerPoint slideshow, 80-something slides. I like to do 120, but so this is just 80. But I'm going to promise you we're not going to do all 80 slides. They're just there because, like most of my colleagues, we call it I call it faculty oppression in my co-counseling community. Have high anxiety about not being prepared. High anxiety. This is what keeps you up late at night. So I want to assure you that anything you could possibly ask or want to know is on one of these 80 slides. And the reason I can be so relaxed and smooth and cool and comfortable right now is that I know for sure that I am prepared. There's nothing, and even that, and there are even more PowerPoint slideshows on that laptop. If one of these doesn't do it, I've got even more slides. So you can be as relaxed as I am. We're covered. So my appendices include something I call the axial age, and then I've got good old Bob Hamilton Kelly's generative mimetic scapegoating mechanism. I've got some slides on the GMSM. I want to say something about restorative practices in connection with restorative justice. And we may never get to this last appendix on DDOs. Robert Keegan at Harvard Business School has popularized this term for what he calls deliberately developmental organizations. Organizations that deliberately help staff, employees, rank and file, all the way up to the CEO, develop personal growth and development in the way you do your job, so that your job is a meaningful. It's not just about showing up and doing the work. It's also about you're becoming an empowered person, a fully developed person. Deliberately developmental organizations. We may not get to that, but that would be for me. That would be for me the ultimate goal of this mimetic theory. That every organization, every family would have built-in practices, best practices for developing your fully realized self as a violence-free person and culture. May not get there in this lecture, but so let's talk then about what mimetic theory is from my perspective. I call it that the ruling metaphor of our inhumanity to one another is that we do target practice. That's what we human beings do to one another in our most inhuman forms. There are many images that manifest our pervasive and vicious targeting of each other, from the schoolyard to the war room, from criticism and gossip to persecution, scapegoating and hate crimes, and ritual killing. So there's just one, we're all in the middle of somebody's bullseye. Or we stand around in circles around each other in the center of some bullseye, and we're the target of that. Target practice, a mimetic theory of our vicious practices. All such targeting reduces human relations to mere object relations, denying our I-thou identities as infinitely valuable objects, indeed as peers and alter egos of each other. And so instead of chuthering, was that the word?
Yeah.
Instead of chuthering with each other, we're antagonized against one another. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, in his book I and Thou, coined this term I-thou relationships between people instead of I-it object relations between people. This image is called blowing from guns in British India. You stand a person up in front of a cannon and you blow the cannon, you shoot the cannonball off in front of their body, their head, and so on. I presume these were people punished, Indians, and punished in India for crimes against the British Empire in the 1800s. 1884, this image comes. So very ingenious. We have very creative and ingenious ways of targeting each other, and that's quite vicious and vivid, isn't it? Yes. So in this regard, then we shift to what Paul emphasized in the morning, that from the perspective of mimetic theory, violence is culturally constructed. It's not just random. It's not just anybody just has a clever idea. It's you can build whole cultural systems around how to do it. Almost, and in the work I hope to do on my own work following that of mimetic theory, I hope to shift the entire paradigm to thinking of violence primarily as an aesthetic category. What could have persuaded us to kill our fellow beings, not in the wanton, amoral manner of barbarians succumbing to their instincts, but as a reflex of awakened consciousness, as creator of cultural forms? How did we develop such ingenuity, such imaginative, intricate forms of refined torment of each other's bodies? That's a great evolutionary question. And Adolphe Jensen, in his book on myths and cults of primitive peoples, 1954, goes on to say that how could we have developed this kind of creative capacity as a way of seeking to comprehend the innermost nature of the world, as a way of discovering the nature of the universe? You know, we're exploring, we're going out, we're like scientifically exploring nature and our own forms of existence, but we're using violence as the kind of medium for it. And how could we have done that as a way of transmitting this knowledge to future generations by means of dramatic representations? This is how you do it, y'all. This rite, this ritual, this process. So a mimetic theory, as Renee has given it to us, is even talks about nonviolence as being a cultural construct emerging from violence. As he says, we do not worship violence as such. There's no cult of violence in the contemporary sense of the phrase. You know, barbarians, you know, just having a heyday on you know, let's have fun with violence. Instead, violence is venerated insofar as it offers what little peace we can ever expect, and nonviolence appears as the gratuitous gift of violence. So this, of course, is his theory that we buy nonviolence, how shall I say that? We pay the price of a little violence to prevent greater violence. And so the mimetic theory is that our communities would be utterly decimated by runaway violence with no braking mechanism if we didn't provide inoculated ways of using a little bit of violence to prevent greater violence. So nonviolence is one from that process. Nonviolence as the gratuitous gift of violence renders human beings capable of reconciling their differences only at the expense of a third party. This is the unanimity minus one of the victim. So Renee says the best we can hope for in our quest for nonviolence is unanimity minus one. So instead of all against all against one is a vast improvement on all against all, right? Instead of all of us in the room having each other's hands at each other's throats, all of us kind of choking the life out of each other, we'll just choose one of us to be the cause and the culprit, and then that's better than losing all of us at each other's hands. And so as I say, this is one way of talking about Hamilton Kelly's term, generative mimetic scapegoating mechanism, which we can come back to in an appendix as time allows. So we have these very refined rituals, and here's the ritual of the first Christian martyr, St. Stephen, being stoned. And it's, you know, so talk about violence as an aesthetic category. Isn't it a beautiful stained glass window? Yeah, or, I mean, isn't this a beautiful mural? But of course, what it's enshrining, what it's encoding, is our target practice, our perennial endemic target practice. Or our common reliance on destructive force as what's going to save us, what's going to redeem us. Violence, as sacred violence in particular here, as our remedy of last resort when all else fails, the final solution as life-giving solvents elude us. If you can't solve anything in any other way, you can bomb the hell out of it. You know, I'm sorry, we can't figure out anything else to do. We've just got to go bomb those people. We got to do something. You can't just do nothing. Yeah, I understand that it's not going to be really effective. It's going to be messy. We're going to, you know, there'll be collateral damage. Innocent lives will be lost. Even our own people will suffer. But we got to do something. So the solvent of last resort, when we can't creatively figure out anything better, which is really a failure of our intelligence or of our will. So it's our captivity to destructive acts that exploit and counterfeit otherwise benign trajectories and ideal orientations. We can't figure out anything better. We resort to this. So there are alternate metaphors of our co-humanity. Compare I-it forms of interaction with the I-thou relations that Buber talks about, and is represented by metaphors of the face by Emmanuel Levinas, or metaphors of the embrace, which is this statue here at Coventry Cathedral, England, as alternative ways of thinking about our relations to one another as I-thou, subject-to-subject relations. So here's some mimetic theory for laughs. I think you're ready for that. That was pretty, all right, you survived the heaviness of it. And so here is two deer in the forest. One says to the other, "That's a bummer of a birthmark, Hal." Yeah, it's not the kind of birthmark you want to be born with. But so the point, you know, so Nietzsche said, what is it? A joke is the epitaph on the death of a feeling. A joke is the epitaph on the death of a feeling. So the epitaph here is, I get it. We're all of us are actually born with that, with a bullseye, waiting to be, you know, waiting for someone to hurl an insult or an accusation at us, and when you finally get that through your head, something dies in you, right? And now we can laugh at it, but it's kind of like gallows laughter. So sorry to bum you out with a cartoon. But that's what scholars are good for. That's what you pay us the big bucks to do. That's right. That's our forte. And we're gonna keep on doing it too. Because we've trained to do this, and you're gonna get a return on your investment in us. Suddenly, second chair granite rock's jealousy of first chair granite rock becomes uncontainable. So even in the primitive band of cave people, there's jealousy and they've got their hierarchy. There's first rock granite player, and second chair granite rock player, and they've got some jealousy going on there. Yeah, so he hits him over the head. He just can't take it anymore. After his father, the prince was next in line for the throne. Well, which throne is it? Any throne, all the thrones, the restroom, the crown, the imperial seat, don't miss the little icon there, lining up for the process, whatever it takes. I'm going to avoid saying anything about British royalty. I'm just not going to go there. A word of advice, Dirk. It's the Mesolithic. We've domesticated the dog, we're using stone tools, and no one's naked anymore. So Dirk just hasn't gotten the word that in the Mesolithic age, you don't go around with your buttocks hanging out. We don't, you know, we evolved a little further than that, Dirk. Get with the program. We all have on furs. So that's about shame and embarrassment in social spaces and games people play and all of that, yeah. As they're having their hors d'oeuvres and cocktails in the cave. It's Bob, all right, but look at those vacuous eyes, that stupid grin on his face. He's been domesticated, I tell you. Yeah. That's our old friend Bob. He used to be one of us, but now he's been tamed. A stupid grin on his face. So we want to figure out how to show up as benign, nice, not vicious. What is it? Bark less, wag more. That's what the bumper sticker says. We want to. So, I'm a good middle class person. I want to show that I've been domesticated, not be going around doing black rage all the time, or whatever version of rage. Didn't you just love that President Obama skit with his anger coach, Luther? Did you see that? Go to YouTube, put in President Obama anger coach. It's Luther who he hired to be angry for him because, heaven forbid, that a black man, as head of the state, should be angry in public. So you had to hire Luther to do it for him, and he did a great job. So that's the domestication that we're all approving of. Finally, his name's Bradshaw. He says he understands I came from a single-parent den with inadequate role models. He senses that my dysfunctional behavior is shame-based and codependent, and he urges me to let my inner cub heal. I say, we eat him. All right. So once you understand all these dynamics about violence and sacred violence and scapegoating and persecution and targeting, don't go out and celebrate that you finally figured it all out. Watch out. They can still come get you. However much you tell them, come on now, you're just acting out your shame. You just need to let your inner child heal. Come on. No, it's not as easy as that. So they can still come eat you, even no matter how much you've figured it out. They can still come eat you. Anyway, so this was the conference in 1999 that we organized at Cover in Atlanta at Emory University, hosting. It was called Violence Reduction. Oops. Ooh, don't want to do that, do I? Don't know that I can get that off. Violence Reduction in Theory and Practice. And from primates to nations, because we have a primate center, very famous Yerkes Primate Center at Emory. It's famous because it's directed by Frans de Waal, the Dutch primatologist who's worked with the bonobo apes and has discovered ways in which our primate ancestors or cousins have conflict resolution practices, best practices for making love, not war. Using sex as a medium for reducing tensions in their populations and in their relationships and so on. Other ways in which primates have an instinctive form of conflict resolution. So he's championed that perspective, and he actually presented at our conference in 1999. I was not successful in getting a representative of the Carter Center to come. I wanted that full spectrum from primates at one end to international conflict resolution at the Carter Center at the other end, and everything in between. So that was the goal of the conference. Quotation here from Gandhi: "We're constantly being astonished these days at the amazing discoveries in the field of violence, but I maintain that far more undreamt of and seemingly impossible discoveries will be made in the field of nonviolence." Isn't that hopeful? What if we could be just as skilled and brilliant as a species with nonviolent transformations as we are with violent transformations? So who was it who, Bishop Bishop Curry at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan quoted Teilhard de Chardin. Once we figure out this thing about violence, it will be the second time that we will have discovered fire. In our species will have discovered fire. So this quotation was that a full spectrum of violence reduction theory and practice already exists, ranging from primate studies to international affairs with much more in between, and needing only to be correlated in order that new syntheses can emerge to propagate violence-free societies throughout the next millennium. How hopeful. That's somebody, what is it, Slave to Hope? Where's it, Slave to Hope? Our Elder Harris, Slave to Hope, yes. Or St. Paul's Hoping Against Hope. So, Edward Hicks' classic American painting, 1826, of the Peaceable Kingdom is our classical American icon for that kind of hope. And in the same way as contemporary film, particularly sci-fi films, often reflect, and horror films, our nightmares as a culture. These paintings, many of these early paintings, reflected our dreams. And so here you have the Puritan fathers in the background having a meal with Native Americans. And then, of course, in the foreground is the quotation from Isaiah, the lion shall lie down with the lamb, and a child shall feed over the hole of the snake and not be harmed. I keep doing that, don't I? So, Peaceable Kingdom, yes. So that's insofar as we have an American dream, this is going to have to be on the agenda for the American dream of a peaceable kingdom. So let's transition now to atonement theory, the problem of beloved community. And I begin with a quotation from the book by our friend James Allison. By the way, I cannot find this quote in The Joy of Being Wrong. I got to see the dissertation before it became a book, and I asked James, where in the book can I find this quotation? And he said, I don't know. So anyway, but here's my favorite quotation from the dissertation, which should be in the book, called The Joy of Being Wrong. It is, in the concrete circumstances of humanity, what the new unity of humanity looks like is the beginnings of the gathering of penitent persecutors around the body of the self-giving victim. So this is our Eucharistic circle that transcends and trumps, if you will, the sacrificial circle. In ritual sacrifice, we gather around victims and throw stones at the victim in the center, or knives, or electrical switches, or whatever. And then we all experience unanimity, because we've decided that this is the culprit, and we can agree on that if we can agree on nothing else. In the Eucharistic table, we gather as penitent persecutors around the body of the self-giving victim, around the symbolic body and blood of remains of the victim. And in the name of that victim, we vow to stop doing this. We hear a word of pardon. I know that you did not know what you were doing. And we go out rejoicing that we've been pardoned, delivered from our viciousness, forgiven for our viciousness, and vowing to go out into the world giving our own body and blood in place of new victims, being Christ-like ourselves in place of new victims. So that's an elevator speech sketch of the Holy Eucharist, which most people don't get to hear as the gospel good news. You know, why did they do that thing? What's that hocus pocus all about? Well, that's the deep structure of the Holy Eucharist. The gatherings of penitent persecutors around the body of a self-giving victim. And here's my Afrocentric version of that from the Vanderbilt Library, Divinity School Library collection of Christian art. Isn't it luminous? The term beloved community was popularized in mid-20th century in the mid-20th century United States by the celebrated civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King. But it was coined in 1913 by American philosopher Josiah Royce in his magnum opus, The Problem of Christianity. King must have read it when he was a graduate student at Boston University. There, Royce introduced it as a framework for encompassing and exploring human loyalty. So as a pragmatist philosopher in the tradition of Dewey and William James and Charles Peirce and is it Santiago also? Santayana, sorry. He focused on loyalty as the key ingredient for communities of solidarity, and even violent, even vicious communities like say the Nazi Party, where loyalty is the cohesive element for creating solidarity. And he thought that the problem of Christianity is the problem of creating loyalty that's transcendent, that creates a community that you would dare to love. You would risk loving it. You would risk giving yourself absolutely, unconditionally. You would risk your unconditional love being your posture, your attitude toward a community that would merit such loyalty. Now, this is an ideal community, and Royce was very clear that it's not pragmatically realizable in the real empirical world, but it's like the limit that you're always reaching for, trying to establish pragmatically. So the problem of Christianity is creating such communities, such beloved communities. How to do it pragmatically. And in that regard, he was a theorist of beloved community, and Dr. King we regard as both theorist and practitioner of it. His book, Strength to Love, is a key version of that, and his disciple, Congressman John Lewis, I gather an alum of this place, did we hear from President Harris? Is the only U.S. congressman I know who talks about a love ethic in the public square. How many congressmen do you know who go around talking about love ethic? It's John Lewis. And that's a theorist practitioner of beloved community. That's what they do. Not enough of them. This is quoting Royce from The Problem of Christianity. No baseness or cruelty of treason so deep or so tragic shall enter our human world, but that loyal love shall be able in due time to oppose to just that deed of treason its fitting deed of atonement. That's his atonement hypothesis. And that's what he thinks. He thinks that's the kind of quintessential Christian answer to toxic community. That there's nothing that's so horrific that loyal love cannot somehow redress and atone for. Nothing. What an absolute statement. And it challenges our creativity. We were talking over at lunch about trauma mastery. You know, how do you build into families and schools and relationships and government processes and the social sphere and public square ways of recovering from trauma, the inevitability of trauma, anticipating it, and then remediating it as a matter of course, as a matter of a way of being in the world. This is what we do. In fact, it's our forte. It's our excellence. It's our genius. That's our tradition, he claims here. And he goes on to make it, so if you think that's extreme, just watch this next one. The world, as transformed by this creative deed, is better than it would have been had all else remained the same, but had that deed of treason not been done at all. Awesome. So this would be the version of the doctrine, the Felix culpa. Happy fault that the sin that required the redemption of our Savior, that sin was committed, because if it had not been, we would not have had, our Savior would not have come to us and given us so many riches of grace and love. So Good Friday is a Good Friday because, however horrific it was as the crucifixion of love, nonetheless the redemption so far exceeds the pernicious of it perniciousness of it, that we would not want to have done without it. So from the fall in Genesis, the doctrine of the fall, to the crucifixion, this is the attitude, this is the posture, this is the disposition. And so if we are in fact kind of ecstatic atonement artists, using again an aesthetic category for our approach to mimetic theory, then we have the kind of we have this kind of joyousness. Oh my goodness. Let's see if we can turn that trauma around and this one around. And let's take on that one. On this view, the challenge, perennial for all peoples and traditions, is how to create such community everywhere through such atoning deeds. What if we pervasively stacked the world, flooded the world, cascade of such atoning deeds? What would our communities look like? What would be the catalytic, runaway, non-stoppable energy? So the following practicum provides a clinic or staging area for first imagining and then rehearsing or pre-enacting such remediating deeds for the communities represented by our diverse identities. So what are your communities of identity and your constituencies to whom you're accountable and for whom you are agent, custodian of care for them, such that you were looking out for what kind of atoning deeds they would need to recover from their experiences of being targeted and traumatized. Who are you looking out for? Did I hear white trash? Do I hear Irish, who became white but weren't before, historically? I certainly have heard African Americans. I hear women, whom Zora Neale Hurston called the mule of the world. The mule of the world. The white man takes the burden, she said, and puts it on the black man. The black man takes the burden off himself and puts it on the black woman. The black woman is the mule of the world. The triple jeopardies of gender, of race, class, and gender for poor black women or poor women of color. So all these communities. So to have done to do your homework for your constituency is to know all the places where they are traumatized and in need of atoning deeds. And if I wanted to show up in the world as an ally to President Trump's political base, Appalachian whites, et cetera, poor whites, I would do my homework on where are they walking around as the walking wounded, and what kind of fitting atonement deeds are they waiting for us to do in their interests so that they can experience us as beloved community. As Ta-Nehisi Coates said, we were 8 years in power and didn't figure that out. And now we are inheriting the whirlwind from that failure of going to them as beloved community. So again, that's the embrace there at the Statue of Reconciliation at Coventry Cathedral. Some related resources here, too small to read. Scripture texts on the word reconciliation. Leave your gift before the altar. First be reconciled by your brother and sister. Romans, for while we were yet enemies, we were reconciled to Christ, to God through the death of his Son. If a woman does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. Shouldn't have done that. We are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making his appeal to us, we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. God was in Christ reconciling himself to the world and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So in this practicum, this has been developed from my mentor, Sherry Brown, in her National Coalition Building Institute, NCBI. And she developed this practicum, and their ground rules, like whatever I say here, I give you permission to share it, but typically we ask you not to share what your partner says without getting permission. So I'll ask you to do this after dinner with me as I model it in a few moments. As we talk about these matters, please practice civility. Stretch your safety zone. Do things that you might find a little bit uncomfortable without, completely bringing up your heaviest, most, up deep-seated trauma but choose something that's got a little challenge to it and cooperate with me as a leader in terms of how we do this. And I'll go over these individually, but there are 5 questions. When was a time that you or your group acted in loyal love toward another person, group, institution, or tradition? Show off with pride. Number 2, when was a time that you or your group failed to act in loyal love to another group or person by betraying that other group or person or acting in treason to beloved community? So I'm just incorporating Royce's ideas of beloved community in these questions. But the practicum was designed by Sherry Brown as a way of working on being an ally to another group. So, for example, if I were having challenges as a black person being an ally to LGBTQ people, as a heterosexual black man, I might go through these questions. When was a time I was loyal to such a group? When was a time I was not? Number 3, when was an early time in your life or the history of your group when you or the group were betrayed by someone else, someone targeting you, and by their failing to show loyal love to you? Number 4, how is number 2 related to number 3? That is, how does your targeting out at others relate to your having been targeted at? Or relate to your targeting in on yourself? So, because we can also scapegoat inside and target in at ourselves as well as out there. And then finally, how would you redress number 3 by replaying the time you failed to show up as an ally or act in loyal love to someone else? How would you do that differently, assuming that you had corrected or done healing work around the place where you were targeted? And the other way to say this is, what is a fitting correction of the betrayal or treason you exhibited when you failed to act in loyal love to another group? What would be a fitting atoning deed for correcting that? So I'm going to ask Ken to come up or wherever to walk through this with me and model it before we go to dinner. And Susan, give me a reality check about time, if you would, in a moment here.
It is 5:57.
Okay. Do we want to break at what time?
6:30.
I don't know if I'm going to run through the rain.
6:30? Until 6:30? Okay, great. So I'm going to invite Ken to, well, we can both talk into this, and you'll just walk me through the questions. Okay?
When was the time you or your group acted in loyal love toward another person, persons, or group, institution, or tradition?
And
Go ahead, show off with appropriate pride, elation, honor, celebrate.
Okay, all right, good. Let's see. So I'll try to make this real time.
When was a time when you or your group failed to do so by betraying another person, persons, or group, or by acting in treason to beloved community? Defy shame or blame to tell the story. Grieve if you're able to.
Yeah, so I've got 2 stories that are kind of iconic for me about this. I was on pilgrimage to Coventry Cathedral, England, and walking in the town, promenading like people do in old world cultures, unlike what we typically do. I saw, as I was promenading, 2 men, arm in arm, hand in hand, promenading in front of me, obviously enjoying being with each other. And off to the side, there were these giggling schoolgirls, laughing at them. Look at those men, doing that thing with each other. And it occurred to me that I could challenge them, that I could show up as an elder. And because I do diversity training, I could have done something creative and imaginative. It occurred to me I could have done something like, I could have walked over to them and said something like, hey, what are you laughing at? What's so funny? Isn't it great to see them out? Or something like that. And the more but But I thought about it and I said, no, nah. They're men, they're tough, they can handle it. And the last thing I saw, things were moving so fast that it was like the window closed, the opportunity was gone. The last thing I saw was just like the grief as the men saw that, understood that what the girls were doing was ridiculing and making fun of them, how their whole visage and countenance and energy changed. You could see that they were affected by it, and that, before they had been kind of enjoying each other's company in the day, and then moments, and then as the scene faded, as the whole thing moved on, you could just see that they were crestfallen and kind of, brokenhearted, kind of a micro moment of brokenheartedness. And defy shame or blame to tell the story and grieve. And I felt the brokenheartedness that I had missed an opportunity that could have been in my power, and was a relatively easy thing to have done. I would never have seen them again. It wasn't going to cost me a lot, but it might have been a useful intervention, and I didn't do it. I didn't step up. I didn't show up.
When was an early time in your life where the history of your group, when you, the group, were betrayed by someone, either failing to show loyal love to you or to you? Express vigorously what you would have said or done in that past situation. Vent freely, if you're able.
Thank you. Yeah. So, in my school, I just got to go back to Phillips Exeter Academy, where I was a scholarship student back in the day, in the mid-'60s, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Black Student Association that I was a co-founder of. So lots of alumni, 50 years, right? And great celebration. We got to, and lots of us Academy boys, one of the things I've learned over the years as a black student, is that the white students were just as traumatized by that place as we were. I had never understood that until I'd read some of their writings about what it was like to be. This was all boys back then. It's now co-ed. And one of the rituals of the place was that they read the dean's list at the end of every semester. Maybe it was just at the end of school year. It seemed every semester when we were going home, you had to sit through hearing all the students who had made the dean's list by having 4.0 grade point average. And then the rest of us who hadn't done that just got to sit there. And I now call that academic terrorism.
Yeah.
Because we're all, and talk about ways of setting up different demographic groups in the school by ethnicity, like who are the ethnic groups that get called, whose names get called, and which ethnic groups don't get called. I felt targeted and betrayed, and they don't do that anymore at Exeter. They finally got some school counselors who figured out that you just don't do that. That's not the way to treat, that's not the way to raise bright, healthy, self-confident, untraumatized high school students, even if they are at boarding school. And Exeter has always had the chaplain at Harvard, Peter Gomes, used to say he could tell Exeter students because they come to Harvard driven by kind of rigor, by kind of like temperamental rigor, the whole attitude was, we're not here to coddle boys. You're here to grow up. You're here to be smart and achieve. And that's what we're here for, and that's what you're going to measure up to that, or you're going to leave. This was before school counseling, and that's shifted with girls there, but lots of us feel like we were the victims and targets of that rigor.
how is incident 2 related to incident 3? That is, how does your targeting out at others relate to your being targeted at? And or relate to your targeting in based on past betrayal by another? Share freely and invite insights from others, remembering our confidentiality agreement.
Yeah. But would you hazard, could I hear just some hypotheses of how those two might be related? My failure to show up as an ally to the gay men as I was pilgrimaging at Coventry Cathedral, my failure to show up as an ally, how is that related to my having been, to the story I told about being targeted in boarding school myself as a schoolboy? Hypotheses, connections, please. And let's say names too, please.
Yeah, Mary McKinney. Well, it was kind of, when you were at Exeter, it sounds like it was kind of like, you need to grow up, you need to stand up for yourself and be a man, and you can do it. And so that could also color just what you said. Well, they're guys, they can take it. So I'm wondering if those two things are sort of work together that way.
And guys don't need compassion or interventions or whatever, or care. We don't, you know. Any other conjectures, please?
I just said we're tough.
We're tough, yeah. Yeah. Pretty clear how that works? So step number 5.
How would you redress incident 3 by replaying or role-playing it differently? That is, what is a fitting correction of the betrayal or treason exhibited in that incident? Exult in the freedom to reimagine ourselves and recreate our world.
Thank you. So, if I could go back to that moment, I would certainly have figured out a way, as I suggested, to have said to the girls, I'm thinking of the Stevie Wonder song. Did we hear it? Where did I hear it? Did I hear it at the royal wedding? Isn't she lovely? Aren't they lovely? Isn't this a lovely thing? These guys caring for each other like that. I mean, what would it have cost me? Or the more kind of challenging thing, why are you laughing? That's what they. A lot of people do diversity training. That's what you're often trained to do. Ask questions, and draw the other person out. Draw them so that they get to have a little session of healing themselves. So what are you laughing at? Or why is that funny? Or, but now but I can tell you that in terms of a fitting, my deeds, creative deeds of atonement going forward, not being able to go back in time and do. And repair that situation. My creative deeds going forward are to show up as an ally to LGBTQ folks, to not neglect opportunities to say, to support their loving relationships as valuable and worthy and treasurable. So that's. I look for opportunities to do that. I've got my radar out for that. Not to say gaydar. Yes.
Just a question. In there, did you mean to have the correction to number 2, which was when you betrayed, or to number 3? It was in question number 5. Or to number 3, which was when you were betrayed.
You're probably right. I may have numbered them incorrectly.
Okay, so you meant for it to be number 2?
Let's see. So number 1 is, when was the time you've acted in loyal love? Number 2, when was the time you failed to do so? Number 3, when was the early time you were targeted? So how would you redress incident number 2 by replaying or role-playing it differently? You're right. It should be 2, not 3.
It should be 2. Okay.
Thanks. Just got mixed up with my numbers.
Thank you.
Yeah. I've done this before. Again, I'll ask you to do it after dinner. I've done this before. So, for example, another set of incidents was that when my brother and I were playing outside at our house when they were reconstructing the interstate behind our house Birmingham, Interstate 20, I-20. Basically, when we first moved to this black suburb, we had lots of trees and forest and turtles and squirrels to explore and so on. But then they put the interstate behind it, and it's now mostly gone. But the construction worker, the guy who was driving a bulldozer, teased us one day by aiming the bulldozer at us as if he were going to run over us. And we went inside the house and got our BB guns, and I shot him in the back of the head with a BB. I would not do that again. I remember him touching his head like this. And that relates to an incident that I had as a boy when I was riding my bicycle on one of the roads in our neighborhood. Two white men came by in a pickup truck, and one of them leaned out with a golf club and swung it at my head and did not hit me. But ever since then, I've got like a place like at the back of my head where I imagined that it had hit me, even though it never did. And Mark Twain has a great quote about that. He says, "I've survived some terrible things in my life, some of which actually happened." Yeah, that's what you want Mark Twain for, right? I've survived some terrible things in my life, some of which actually happened. Well, I did not actually get hit. But, so if I'm answering this question, place where I failed to show up as an ally to a redneck, but instead acted stereotypically in a kind of reactionary, vengeful way, I would say that's related to my having been targeted in that other incident. So those are the kind of examples that I'm offering. Comments, questions, observations? Yes, please.
When you're using this in a group for a setting, trying to bring reconciliation within a group, do you typically use it more for talking about the group rather than just you?
I let the group figure it out. I let you go where you want to go. I try to give both examples of as you did in your talk this morning, the individual and the systemic, and let people go where they're ready to work. And you may not be ready to work at the systemic level of the group or the history of your people. You may need to do individual work first, but our goal is to actually have a symbiosis between those two things, right? That's really the challenge. Places where you're individually experiencing being targeted at, that keeps you from showing up as an ally in relationship to another person as an individual or co-worker, or to an entire group as a constituency. Other comments, observations? Yes, please.
I'm Preston. When you were talking earlier, I think that you referenced some of the poor whites, reaching out, thinking about their woundedness. And while you were talking, I was thinking about the work of Baptist minister Will Campbell. And Will is pretty well known around here because he lived around here. And I hadn't really thought of him. He was fairly influential on me several years ago when I was kind of first exposed to some of his work. But some of the things you said kind of brought him back to the front of my mind. I want to reread some of the things that he said, because he said when you understand the nature of tragedy, you can't take sides. And I've puzzled over that, and some things you said, I think, that maybe made it just a little bit clearer. He was so active in the civil rights movement. But then after the civil rights movement, during and after the civil rights movement, towards the tail end, he started ministering to the Klan. And that's something else that I think that I have not really maybe reckoned with in the right way, or really tried to grapple with. And maybe this isn't a question, I'm trying to articulate it, but maybe what do you do with someone like Will Campbell, who seems to be getting at some of what you were talking about, in terms of what actions do I need to take for people who I might be willing to scapegoat myself?
Right.
What kind of atonement actions, self-sacrificing actions maybe I should be willing to take? Brother Will, he came under fire when he started trying to minister to Clemson.
Right. So I'm trying to quote the Marjorie Sue Hockey in her book, The Fall to Violence. She says, forgiveness is willing the well-being of both victim and victimizer with the fullest possible knowledge of the nature of the victimization. And there's something you said, Preston, maybe you'll remember it, that made me think of this, with the fullest possible knowledge of the nature of the victimization. And this nicely relates to what Phyllis, the word that Phyllis was giving us earlier today about epistemic communities. Fullest possible knowledge of the nature of the victimization. And so, as you were saying, what was the quote? If you understand how tragic, thank you.
One who understands the nature
Forget
of
it.
tragedy never takes sides.
I'm just going to put it on the other easel. Thanks for trying. So Marjorie Sue Hockey, the book is called, that's okay, you can just abandon it. The book is called The Fall to Violence by Marjorie Sue Hockey. So this is the homework we're enjoined to be doing. And what is the French proverb? To understand everything is to forgive everything, or to forgive too much. Sometimes that's the way people take that quotation. You understand too much, you're a bleeding heart. That way you're never going to hold anyone accountable. Well, I think that we can do better than that, and that leads then to the part of my slide show that we may not get to. The movement is called, in the appendix here, restorative practices. We'll just go through, we'll skip some of the Hamilton Kelly's GMSM here and move to restorative practices. This is a movement that came out of the restorative justice movement, in which you don't simply work on the polarization between victim and victimizer. You restore the entire community and use the polarity, the dyad, the duality of the victim and victimizer, the offender and the victim as an occasion for healing restoring the entire community. So the social discipline window is that you don't simply do punitive things or neglect people or do things for people, but you do things with people as the restorative approach. Human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So you go to your Appalachian community and say, and you sit there long enough for them to trust you to help to figure out, well, what can we do together that will satisfy you about the way you've been jerked around economically in the job market or by corporate powers and so on and so forth. So you're not figuring it out for them, but with them. So this restorative practices continuum has formal and informal ways of working in this way with groups. And the aim of these restorative practices is to develop community, to manage conflicts and tensions, either proactively or reactively. And part of the goal here is to deal with issues of shame and to help people manage shame dynamics without withdrawing or attacking other people or attacking in at oneself or avoiding them entirely. So there's some emotional intelligence going on in this restorative practices movement. that comes out of the restorative justice movement. And this is my effort to suggest that that you're navigating issues of shame, that people are primarily telling you that the measure of their anger, the way in which they're pushing back at you with bitterness and viciousness, is a measure of the degree to which they've been shamed, invalidated by their experience in the world, by their conditions, by their social conditions and economic conditions. And there's, I call here, and I'm using the work of T.J. Sheff on emotional sociology of emotions, that there's a zone of normal shame where you're ashamed about things you do, but then there's a deeper dimension of abysmal shame where you're ashamed about who you are. And when you shame someone at this deep structural level about who they are, as opposed to what they do, the pushback you're going to get is going to be ferocious, or you're going to lose them. Or they will just get sunk. You'll lose them psychodynamically. They will be catatonic or listless or victim, sunk into victimage. And so navigating shame is one of the latest developments and lots of social and psychosocial transformation projects. Brené Brown on vulnerability and all of that, learning through shame. And Anthony Appiah, the philosopher at, is it Harvard or Yale, I can never remember, has written the honor code called, subtitled, How Moral Revolutions Happen. Talks about the revolutionary power of honor in ending human suffering, which is, of course, the antidote to shame. Long neglected as an engine of reform, honor strikingly emerges at the center of our modern world. In his book, The Honor Code, over the last few centuries, new democratic movements have led to the emancipation of women, slaves, and the oppressed. But what drove these modern changes, Appiah argues, is not imposing legislation from above, but harnessing the ancient power of honor from within. In gripping detail, Appiah explores the end of the duel in aristocratic England, the tumultuous struggles over foot binding in 19th century China, and the uprising of ordinary people against Atlantic slavery. Finally, he confronts the horrors of honor killing in contemporary Pakistan, that you referred to in your talk this morning, Sati, where rape victims are murdered by their relatives. He argues that honor used to justify the practice can also be the most effective weapon against it. Intertwining philosophy and historical narrative, Appiah has created a remarkably dramatic work which demonstrates that honor is the driving force in the struggle against our inhumanity to one another. So basically with foot binding, I didn't read the whole book, but he finally says that Chinese officials just got sick, got shamed about being represented as barbaric by their Western colleagues at government events, at high political events. They could not continue to bear being regarded as primitive and backward because of their support for foot binding. And that shame helped win them over to legislation reducing foot binding in China. So all of this suggests that if we could figure this out, the psychosocial dynamics about targeting in and targeting out, what makes us feel abysmal shame and how to harness that so that we're not targeting out at others, we could be much more creative and skilled. Aren't we smart enough for this? It's the 21st century. We're brilliant at software and biogenetics and astrophysics. Can't we figure this out? Isn't it about time? Yeah. Restorative and therapeutic jurisprudence. Can't we do more than one thing at a time? It does it have to be either or? So how's our time? I've got a few more minutes.
6:27.
Well, let's just go back just a little bit for folks who are still getting on board with the mimetic theory. I just love this with Hamilton Kelly's focus on the generative mimetic scapegoating mechanism on what we're really after in mimetic theory is is to reorient our triangle of desire around the true transcendence and not the false transcendent of the model, of the obstacle model. So his quote is that the triangularity of desire means that human being is structured with reference to transcendence. Human desire is mediated desire. It comes from without, not from within. And so we have here the object, the model of our desire, and we are subjects desiring objects, but not because the objects are desirable intrinsically, but because these objects belong to our models. And our models can either be obstacles or consensually say, yes, become like me, have what I have, do what I do. The state of mimetic rivalry is the pathology of a deviated transcendence, of a desire that should be aroused from a truly transcendent spiritual source, but instead is aroused by the immanent neighbor. The biblical name for this is idolatry, and its antidote is faith in the unseen God. So instead of having each other as the idol, or other powers as the idol for penultimate models, then we would have, the Buddha, or Moses, or our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, or the Hindu Godhead, some other transcendent source as a worthy model. And there have been efforts to look at this culturally in terms of our dynamics as a culture. This is called the triangle of European desire. It's a model of the slave trade across the Atlantic, the so-called triangle of the slave trade. So we've superimposed, this author has superimposed the Girardian triangle of mimetic desire over the slave trade as a mercantile system of mimetic desire. So Europe, manufactured goods were brought from Europe to Africa in exchange for slaves taken to the Americas, where they worked on raw materials that were taken back to Europe. So that's a cultural representation of the triangle of desire. And then this is an effort to talk about Pan-African desire, the desire to return. I virtually said something like that in my comment about my African family, that there's a kind of idealization of Africa with focus either on the Caribbean or South America by African Americans in the United States. A kind of triangle of desire that's about reclaiming a holistic heritage of honor and value and worthiness. So this picks up Rebecca Adams' notion of loving mimesis, and picks up your critique, Paul, about Renee. Renee liked to lean into the dark side of mimesis, and there are lots of us who want to lean the other way, and this is one way to do that. Good place to stop.
Yeah.
I look forward to doing more with you after dinner.
Yeah.